Hello, everybody. Good afternoon, good evening, depending on what time of day, what time zone you're watching us in. I'm Ali Sethi, here with the wonderful scholar, teacher, my mentor, Professor Ali Asani of Harvard University. And we are here today to talk about and think about and perform a little bit in the course of the art of the Ghazal. The Ghazal, as many of us know, is one of the leading, most beloved forms of poetry in the Indo-Muslim world. And I, having grown up on Ghazals, listening to Ghazals, have come to be a kind of new age Ghazal singer, if you will. I have always drawn on the Ghazal as a singer, also as a citizen, as a subject, as a member of a sort of Indo-Muslim civilization. I've always drawn on the Ghazal for spiritual nourishment, for sensuous license, and also for courage to stand up for my convictions. The Ghazal has kind of provided me with a map of the emotional and intellectual universe of the Indo-Muslim world. Professor Ali Asani will now talk more about the Ghazal, where it comes from. But I think the one thing that we decided was most appealing to us about the Ghazal as a genre of music and as a form of poetry is how it revels in ambiguity, how the Ghazal allows us to glean multiple interpretations, often potentially conflicting or contradictory meanings inside a single sher or couplet. In that sense, it really articulates, in my opinion, a truly modern, progressive, flexible, truly liberal sensibility that can really help us navigate our world, our multicultural, cosmopolitan world today. Over to you, Professor Ali Hassan.
Thank you, Ali, for that, for those remarks. And it's always a pleasure to work with you on events like this. And I know you claim that I'm your teacher and you learned this stuff from me, but I've learned just as much from you about the beauty of the Ghazal. I think I'd like to start by, just to follow up your comments. When I think about the Ghazal, I think about pluralism and diversity. You know, we talk about pluralism and diversity in our world today, how it's become such an important issue. And this is a literary genre that thrives on diversity and pluralism and highlighting marginalized voices. So I will start giving just a brief sort of basic, for people who don't know about the Ghazal, a basic sort of introduction. So the Ghazal, very often people translate it as a love lyric, connected with love. But the kind of love, the English word love doesn't capture the richness of words like ishq, that are very often used in Persian and Urdu and so on, this word like ishq, which means you're on the yearning, longing type of love, but also a love that transforms. And so very often the Ghazal is about the transformative power of love, longing, separation, longing for union, longing for the beloved, and so on. So that's why this is sort of the area, the specialized subject of the Ghazal. In its origin, it's believed to have emerged in the, I think originally in the Arabic language with the Qasida, which is a praise poem, and the praise poem had the first part of it was was an amatory prelude where the poet talked about, in nostalgic ways, about a lost love, a lost beloved. And eventually that part of the Qasida separated out and became a separate genre itself, and became very popular in Persian and Urdu. And then later on, people tried to imitate it in other different languages. The structure of the Ghazal is that it is, as a poetic form, it is it is each part, each verse consists of two parts or two divisions. So the technical name for a verse is bait. And interestingly, this word bait can mean a house in Arabic, but also a tent. And then this bait, this couplet, has two hemistages. So two components to it. And each of these hemistages is called a misra. So bait is the couplet as a whole, and then each half of the couplet, the hemistage, is called the misra. Now, the word misra in Arabic is also interesting because it means the flaps of the tent. So in a certain way, when you, it's sort of the, when the poet is composing this, is also, it's invoking the language of architecture. You're building up something, right? So that's something interesting. The other interesting characteristic of the ghazal is that all the lines follow the same meter. So you can have meters that are a combination of long and short syllables, but once you have the meter, then all the lines must conform to that meter. So that meter holds the verse together, the entire composition together. What also holds the composition together is usually a word that ends up, a rhyming word that keeps on repeating itself during the ghazal, the structure of the ghazal. So I'll just give you an example from a very popular Urdu ghazal sung by Jagjit and Chitra Singh. Sarakti jai hai rukh se nikab, ahista ahista. Nikalta aa raha hai aftab, ahista ahista. So this ahista ahista is the rhyming word, which is called the radif. And in the first verse of any ghazal, you will have both hemistages end with this, the radif, ahista ahista, but then subsequent verses, only the second hemistage will have this radif. Usually before the radif, you also have what's known as a kafia, and a kafia is a rhyming sound. So for example, in the verse I just said, Sarakti jai hai rukh se naqab, ahista ahista. So the kafia is ab, ahista ahista, the word nikab, veil. So nikab, ahista ahista. So ab is the kafia. And then in the next line, you'll see nikalta aa raha hai aftab, ahista ahista. So you see nikab and ahista, nikab and aftab rhyme with each other in the sense they have the AD. So that's the kafia. So when a ghazal composer is putting the piece together, you have to be very careful that every time you have the radif, you have a word that has this rhyme. So in this particular ghazal, ab, ahista, ahista. So all the lines that have ahista, ahista must have some sort of ab there. So that's called a kafia. And then usually at the end of the ghazal, and ghazals are not long compositions, 8 to 10 couplets at the most. And at the end, you have what's called a takhallus, which is the poetic name or the nom de plume of the writer, incorporated within the lines of the message of the ghazal itself. One other thing that one needs to keep in mind of the ghazal is that even though it's 8 or 10 baits at the most, there's no continuity of thought. In the sense, you're not trying to tell a narrative. So you're talking about love and unfulfilled love, but you're talking about an ashik who is a lover, and you're talking about a mashuk who's a beloved. And usually the ghazal is told from the perspective of the ashik, the lover, who is lamenting this a mashuk who's totally ignoring him or her, and sometimes even the cruelty, the pain that the poet, the ashik feels. So So this is sort of the persona, but when you read the ghazal, um, the voice can keep on changing, the theme keeps on changing, so you don't necessarily have a continuous narrative. And that's why you'll find people can recite ghazals and sometimes change, and it doesn't really affect the ghazal at all. Or people can quote lines from a ghazal at random, and it would still make sense. So I think this is all I wanted to say about the structure. Oh, one more thing I should point out, this is a technical part. The beginning of the first bayt, the beginning of the ghazal, is usually referred to as matla. Matla means the rising point, the point where the ghazal is rising. It's all right. And then the last verse, where you have the end, the name of the poet, is called makta, the place where things are cut off, the cutting off point. So you have the matla and the makta. So this is the technical vocabulary associated with the ghazal in a summary. So with this, I am going to turn now to look at our first ghazal. And of course, in the course of discussing our ghazals, we'll point out features like what's the radif and what's the kafiyah and so on. The first ghazal we are going to be looking at is by the famous poet Amir Khusro. So Amir Khusro was born in India. He died in 1326. He had a Turkish father and an Indian mother, and he was somebody that I would call a cosmopolitan person. Not only in the sense that he was multi-talented, he was a historian, he was a poet, he was a musician, but also, he was part of a world that I've called the Turco-Persian world, because northern India was part of an empire that was Persian-speaking and whose rulers were of Turkish origin, and that connected them to Iran, Central Asia, and also what is now Turkey. So Amir Khusro came from that kind of cosmopolitan world that stretched way beyond what we see as India, and through the Persian language, influences crept into South Asia. And Amir Khusro also at the same time was very proud of his Indian heritage, because his mother was Indian. He loved things Indian too. So he was somebody who was a bridge between this Persianate world. You see the kinds of things that are attributed to him, for example, the sitar, or some people even say the qawwali, that all these art forms where he tries to bring together or fuse traditions. And so he becomes a very important exponent of the ghazal in South Asia, but he wrote mostly ghazals in Persian. And the ghazal that we are going to share with you today, this selection, is one of his most famous ghazal, which I will just go over the words very quickly. It's Namidanam che manzil bud shabjai man budam. Par harsu rakse bismil bud shabjai ke man budam. And this line is actually very interesting because it's roughly translated. It says, I wonder what was that place where I was last night. All around me was a dance of ecstasy. So that's how this ghazal begins. And the radif in this one is man budam, you'll see. And so this is how this verse begins, this ghazal begins. And in terms of trying to understand what this means, one of course needs to have the keys to unlock the inner meanings of this ghazal. What does last night mean? What does this dance of ecstasy mean? And for this, to interpret a ghazal like this, you have to be very familiar with the vocabulary and where it's coming from. So for me, when I started exploring the inner meanings of this ghazal, not going going beyond the literal translation. I connect this to actually an event in the Quran where before creation took place, God addressed the uncreated creation with the words, Alastu bi Rabbikum, am I not your Lord? And the uncreated creation responded by saying, Bala Shahidna, yes, we witness it. And this event is very often seen or interpreted by poets as the beginning of the compact of love, the compact of Ishq, the covenant of Ishq between God and all of creation. And so the primordial moment of creation is actually an act of acknowledgement of love. And because everything, all of creation is in the presence of the beloved, it is ecstatic because it's a moment of joy, because you're in the presence of the beloved. And in the Ghazal, to be in the presence of the beloved is the greatest joy possible because you can see the beloved. And so he begins this Ghazal with this last night, meaning, of course, the primordial time. So today is the present. Last night would be the past, the primordial past. So I don't know where I was last night. Amir Khusro has a fantastic image where he says, Khuda khud mere majlis bood, andar la makan Khusro. That God himself was presiding over this assembly. And then the next line is Muhammad Shame Mehfil Bood, Shab Jai Ke Man Budam. That the Prophet Muhammad, peace be on him, was actually the candle of this assembly. Now, in recitations of poetic works called Mehfil, usually the poet whose turn it was to recite, tradition says that we have a candle placed in front of them. And that's why that poet would be called Mehfil, the candle of the poetic assembly, because the limelight, as it were, would be falling on this poet. So here he imagines this act of creation taking place. He imagines actually as a poetic assembly where everyone is gathered to enjoy poetry. And presiding over this is God himself, and that the greatest sort of exponent of knowledge, of thought here is in fact the figure of the prophet. Ali, I don't know whether you want to say something about this, or from.
Yeah, just that I heard a version of this melody that I'm going to perform now in Lahore from a young Qawwal who'd heard it from his ancestors. So I don't know who made this tune, but I think we can say it's a rivayati or traditional tune because it has been, at least for 2 generations, it's been inside a guild of Qawwals or performers of this kind of poetry. What I find interesting is that when you sit down to compose a ghazal, you also have to abide by these principles of rhythm. So if you allow me, I will now sing this Namidanam that I have heard in Lahore and show you the sort of what we call the semi-classical treatment of the ghazal. Ijazat?
Namidanam che manzil bood, Namidanam che manzil bood, Shab jaye ki man boodam, Namidanam che manzil bood, Shab jaye ki man boodam, Bahar surak se bismil bood, Bahar surak se bismil bood. Shab jaye ke man bodam, Namidanam che manzil bood, Shab jaye ke man bodam, Khuda khud mere majlis bod, Khuda khud mere majlis bod, अंदर लाम का खुसरो खुदा खुद मीर मजलिस बूद आ खुदा खुद मीर मजलिस बूद अंदर राम का खुसरो मोहम्मद शम महफिल बूद मोहम्मद शम महफिल बूद शब जाए कि मन बूदम मोहम्मद शम महफिल बूद शब जाए कि मन बूदम नमीता ऊंचे मंजिल बूद शब जाए कि मन बूदम.
So thank you, Ali, for that wonderful rendition of this very famous ghazal. The next poet we are going to look at is also a very interesting poet. He is one of the earliest exponents of ghazal in the Urdu language. I mentioned Amir Khusro in writing Persian, and for many centuries, Persian was the dominant mode of literature, especially in North India, and all poets wrote in Persian. But by the 17th, 18th century, people started experimenting with Urdu. And some of that experimentation took place in what is now the Deccan in southern India. And one of the poets involved in this experimenting with Urdu was Siraj Aurangabadi, who lived in what is now Aurangabad, and he died in 1763. Now, by training, Siraj was an exponent of Persian poetry. He was fluent in Persian. He was a great fan of Hafiz, the great Persian poet who specialized in ghazals, whose ghazals had become so famous. So Siraj was very much influenced by the Persian poet Hafiz, and he started composing ghazals in Urdu. Now, his composition of ghazals is interestingly tied in not just as an artistic, endeavor on his part, but it's actually tied to his life story. So the story goes that Siraj, when he, in his younger, youthful days, fell in love with a soldier who happened to be Hindu. And then this relationship broke up, and Siraj was totally devastated. And some people say he was so depressed, became so desolate, that he was just wandering around like a madman. And there are stories about how, at some point his father was thinking about tying him up in chains because, to control him. We don't know to what extent these were true or not, but in any case, he had this really traumatic experience of a broken heart. And as he started wandering around, he eventually found refuge in a Sufi dargah, which was presided over by a peer, a spiritual mentor, Abdur Rahman Chishti, who gave refuge to Siraj Aurangabadi, and they must have discussed matters of faith, of mysticism, of life, of existence, and so on. So eventually, Siraj decided that, material love in the physical world, or physical beloveds, material beloveds are always fickle, and the only true beloved is God. And so he starts composing ghazals, being a member of this dargah, and they would have concerts. Now, these ghazals very often are interpreted in a mystical way, and this is what we talked about earlier, the ambiguity. So this idea that you could take the language of human love and understand it also to be relevant to divine love, because all love comes actually from God. So God is sort of the origin of all love, and human love is just a reflection of this, and love for creatures. So the whole world, is governed by this principle of love in its many, many different forms. So human love, the material love, which is called ishq majazi, is actually a guide to the real love. It's a stepping stone, ishq hakiki, love of God. So Siraj started composing these exquisite ghazals, and people would come for these mystical assemblies called the Sama, where these ghazals would be recited very often in the context of a qawwali performance. And Siraj became very, very famous. But at a certain point, his peer asked him to stop composing ghazals because maybe he thought it was not beneficial for him. Maybe it was too dangerous for him. Maybe he was building an ego or whatever it was, but he was asked to stop. So he stopped composing. And so this ghazal that we are going to talk about next is one of his ghazals, Khabare Tahure Ishq Sun, Na Junoon Raha, Na Pari Rahi, Na To Tu Raha, Na To Me Raha, Jo Rahi, So Be Khabari Rahi. And roughly, it's saying, listen to the confounding story of love, where neither crazed obsession nor charming beauty remain, where neither I remain nor you remain. All that remains is a state beyond awareness. Now, Ali has actually worked quite a bit on this ghazal. He has composed music for this with Noah Georgeson, and I'll just turn it over to him to talk about the ghazal a little bit, and then we have a couple of some of the other verses in the ghazal, and then we'll listen to it.
So this ghazal I was introduced to some years ago. I think about 4 or 5 years ago. Professor Asani brought it to my attention. We were having a Skype chat, and you mentioned these lines, and they kind of just got stuck in my head. And I was fiddling around with my keyboard one day and started humming them because they suggest this almost waltz-like rhythm, right? I hear it as music first and as poetry later. It's just the way my mind works. So when I heard Khabare tahayyur ishq sun na junu raha na pari rahi na to tu raha na to main raha jo rahi so be khabari rahi, right? It suggests the Khabare tahayyur ishq sun na junu raha na pari rahi, right? That's one way. So in 3s and 6s is one cycle, and which is like becomes a waltz, and which has a kind of whirling, sort of propulsive, a sort of tarrying and propulsive kind of rhythm to it. And the second way of doing it is in a 7-beat, 7-matra cycle. So Khabare tahayyure ishq sun na junu raha na pari rahi na to tu raha. So that's the way that many qawwals have actually done it, is in a 7-beat cycle. But I heard it as a 3 and 6, as a waltz. So we composed it, I composed it, and then we got together with our friend Noah Georgeson. It was wonderful. I'm going to now, I think, sing this ghazal. Khabare tahayyure ishq sun na junu raha na pari rahi na to tu raha na to main raha jo rahi so be khabari rahi. And this is my own tune for this ghazal.
गैब से एक हवा चली सुनते गैब से एक हवा के चमन ज़हूर का जल गया चली सुनते गैब से एक हवा के चमन ज़हूर का जल गया मगर एक शाख ने हाले गम मगर एक शाख ने हाले गम जिसे दिल कहे ज़ोहरे रहे ना तो तू रहा ना तो मैं रहा जो रहे खबरें खबरें तेरे इश्क सुन खबरें तेरे इश्क सुन न जुनू रहा न परे रहे न तो तू रहा न तो मैं जो रहे सुबह खबरें खबरें तेरे इश्क सुन वो जब घड़े थे कि जिस घड़ी लिया दर्स नुस्खा इश्क का वो जब घड़ी के जिस घड़ी लिया दर्स नुस्खा इश्क का जो किताब की ताक पर जो किताब की ताक पर सोए दरे गिदरे न तो तू रहा न तो मैं जो रहे सुबह खबरें खबरें तेरे इश्क सुन खबरें तेरे इश्क सुन न जुनू रहा
Which actually brings us to the role of women singers in popularizing the Ghazal genre, both as a poetic form and as a musical genre. And actually that happens around the 18th century, sort of mid to late 18th century, when the figure of the tawaif or the Gane Wali, variously interpreted as singing woman, singing and dancing girl, courtesan, all these sort of words that are applied to the figure of the tawaif. But actually what tawaif really means, what meant originally, now it's undergone this, it's become a pejorative word. What it used to mean was simply a woman who was not in parda, right? A woman who could participate in traditionally male social gatherings and situations. So the Gane Walis, as it were great poets, were trained in the art of classical music, singing, were also trained in the art of classical dance. They knew about philosophy, they knew about history. They were often close advisors to rulers, to princes, to nawabs, to generals. They were, most importantly, and this is a role that the singing women continued to play well into the 20th century when recording technology arrived in the subcontinent. Their most important role in some way was as patrons for these elaborate networks of performing artists in the subcontinent. So, tabla players, sitar players, veena players, sarangi nawazes, poets, the great classical ustads, the maestros who were the great repositories of traditional knowledge, even hakims, doctors, scientists, novelists. So many got their access to the court or to the local patron via the singing woman or the consort, right? And so I think this brings us actually to our next important poet, who is not very far removed in time from Siraj Aurangabadi. Would you like to say a few words about her?
Yes. So this poetess, Ma Lakabai, as she's called, was born in Hyderabad in 1768, and she died in 1824, 1825. And her given name was Chanda Bibi. And very often she uses Chanda as her nom de plume when she's writing ghazals. So Ma Laka is her court title. And she is influenced, or at least people speculate that Siraj Aurangabadi's poetry had an influence on her because he preceded her, and they lived more or less in the same geographic area. So it's very, very, very likely that she had heard of Siraj Aurangabadi's ghazals. And she became really the first woman to have a divan or a collection of Urdu ghazals to be published, albeit posthumously. Her ghazals are, they definitely combine romantic and mystical themes. And what is interesting about her is that on account of her Shia background, her ghazals very often end with an expression of devotion to the first Shi'i Imam Ali, or sometimes even to his son, Imam Hussein. So in her Makta, the last verse, you'll see very often a reference to this. So you can see that she also saw herself as a committed Shia woman poetess who owed her grace and her good fortune to her devotion to the Imams. A very interesting sort of personality. So in addition to being a poet, she learned singing, classical Indian music, specializing in the Tumri from Khushhal Khan, a master musician who was the great grandson of Tansen, who was this maestro, the master musician in the Mughal court. And so she was tied to this musical tradition, and she excelled in singing ghazals in multiple rags, melodic modes, tals, rhythms. And as Ali pointed out, she was really versatile. She knew how to dance. She was a dance performer. She was an advisor in politics, very often to rulers and princes. She was a patron of the arts, and also a woman who gave a lot of donation in charity, in all kinds of philanthropic causes, very often not in her name, but in the name of the Shia Imam.
I found this ghazal of hers. So, you know, in music, you encounter often they'll say to you, this is an arifana ghazal, which means this is a spiritual ghazal, which usually means this is a male ghazal, right? This is somehow what it means is that philosophy is the domain and privilege of male poets, right? And you can, you know, that it has ishke majazi and ishke hakiki, so it has these sensuous meanings, but of course, everything is a vehicle towards love of God. And so there's this kind of, you know, inevitable piety and kind of meta narrative associated with these male, you know, arifana ghazals. And then you will also hear, as I've heard many times, that, oh, this is what they call a mujrai ghazal, right? So mujra, which is supposed to be the song and dance that women have traditionally performed for mostly male audiences. is supposed to be, the Mujrai Ghazal is supposed to be a women's Ghazal, which means that it is mainly seductive. So Mujrai Ghazals are supposed to be minor Ghazals, right? So where the Arifana Ghazal is a major Ghazal, the Mujrai Ghazal is a minor Ghazal. And we see this division all in every society. This idea that men's work is, major and women's work is somehow minor. But what I found so interesting when looking at, she's able to do both things. She's able to give us, bring together a wide range of moods and dimensions, pack them into one ghazal. So let's just look at the verses of this ghazal, which I have, Ali Jan, you will have to forgive me, translated rather freely in the spirit of Malaka Chanda into flirtatious English. Dil ho gaya hai gham se tere daagdar khoob. Dil ho gaya hai gham se tere daagdar khoob. Phoola daagdar khoob. दिल हो गया है गम से तेरे दागदार खूब फूला है क्या ही जोश से ये लालाजार खूब, right? Which means something like this heart has been pierced by your love's woe aplenty. This heart has been pierced by your love's woe aplenty. And then this idea that passion has blossomed the petals of this flower aplenty, right? And that's a very sensual, obviously, image, the idea of a flower blooming, right? As a kind of sensuous response. Phoola hai kya hi josh se ye lala zar khoob. So phool jana, to blossom, but also to heave, right? It's this kind of imagery of breathing and of ebb and flow. It's a very, very erotic and sensuous imagery, obviously. It's contained within the metaphor of the flower, obviously, because we're still inside polite society, but it's very suggestive. Kab tak rahun hijab mein mehroom wasl se, kab tak rahun hijab mein mehroom wasl se, ji mein hai kije pyar se bose kanar hu. So, I mean, a translation would be, how long do I stay veiled away from the bliss of union? How long do I stay veiled away from the bliss of union? My heart desires kisses from my beloved aplenty, right? So I want to kiss with abandon today. Hijab has traditionally been a metaphor. Before hijab, in the modern sense, became this particular head covering that women today wear. Hijab has been, Ali Jan, you will agree with me, a metaphor throughout Urdu poetry. And of course, she's using it as a metaphor for the parda between the lover and the beloved, the veil that prevents full sight of the beloved. Of course, in traditional Islamic theology, this idea of a parda between man and God is also very important, right? We know that Moses is blinded when he actually gets a glimpse of God's light. So the parda is essential, because through the parda, there is this imaginative engagement with the beloved. Saki laga ke barf mein main ki surahila. Saki laga ke barf mein main ki surahila. Aankhon mein cha raha hai nashe ka khumar khoob. So this is a classic, what we would call a classic sort of mujrai sher, where the atmosphere of the salon, of the kotha is being evoked, right? There's a pleasure, the house of pleasures, a place where she's saying to the wine bearer, she's saying, go and, not just saying, bring me the wine, but she's saying, chill it and bring it, serve it chilled. And then she says, Aisi hawa bandhi rahe chanda ki ya Ali. Aisi hawa bandhi rahe chanda ki ya Ali. Basad bahar dekhe jahan ki bahar khoob. Right? So she's evoking Ya Ali, who is obviously her spiritual guide. And she's saying, let Chanda, which is her own self, but also, Chanda is Chand, the moon. So she's a kind of patroness of lunar activities, if you will, right? She says, let aisi hawa bandhi rahe Chanda ki ya Ali. Basad bahar dekhe jahan ki bahar khoob. So in a sense, Ali Jan, correct me if I'm wrong, what she's saying is, let this wind of Chanda, or this breeze, or this
let's say vigor, the energy,
the vigor, the mood, the ravani, also the flag of Chanda. I think of Hawa Bandhi Rahe and Bandhna. I'm thinking of the kind of, the mast of Chanda. Let it flutter. Let this mast that I have planted here, let it flutter eternally, so that the world can see that Chanda also has a place, that she has this eternal, gorgeous sort of, presence. Would you like to say something?
Yeah. I think that so there are a couple of things. I mean, I think that last verse is very intriguing because she talks about earthly spring, Bahar, right? And that she talks about 100, let her be so, let her hawa, her vigorous, her energy be so powerful that is worth 100 times an earthly spring.
Mm-hmm. So I thought it would be appropriate. I made a sort of melody and I hope you like it.
दिल हो गया है गम से तेरे दागदार खूब दिल हो गया है गम से तेरे दागदार खूब फूला है क्या ये जोश से ये लालजार खूब फूला है क्या ये जोश से ये लालजार खूब दिल हो गया है गम से तेरे दागदार खूब कब तक रहूं हिजाब में महरूम वस्ल से कब तक रहूं हिजाब में महरूम वस्ल से जी में कीजे प्यार से बो सो कलार खूब जी में कीजे प्यार से बो सो कलार खूब दिल हो गया है गम से तेरे दागदार खूब दिल हो गया है गम से तेरे दागदार खूब साके लगा के बर्फ में मैं की सुराहिला साके लगा के बर्फ में मैं की सुराहिला आँखों में छा रहा है नशे का खुमार खूब आँखों में छा रहा है नशे का खुमार खूब फूला है क्या ये जोश से ये लालजार खूब दिल हो गया है गम से तेरे दागदार खूब
No, beautiful, Ali. This was very lovely. This is the first time I'm hearing you sing this, so it was. I was looking forward to it, and it's just amazing. The tune that you've composed for this is marvelous. So,
Thank you.
ironic about the ghazal is that you can't take everything literally. So you can take it literally if you want, but you could also take it metaphorically. The meaning is ambiguous, deliberately ambiguous, and ghazals very often use the imagery of wine uh, to talk about as a symbol of love, the intoxicating quality of love, that love overcomes the self, overcomes your selfhood, your ego, just as wine does. So in being intoxicated with love is an experience where you give up yourself. And this is part of what um, the mystical path is, submitting yourself to something higher than you are. Our next poet, the last one for this ghazal, is by Faiz Ahmad Faiz, the most celebrated contemporary poets of Urdu, who has been described as an unofficial poet laureate of Pakistan. He was born in the Punjab in 1911, and he was born in the midst of the Cold War. And it's interesting because of the message of his poetry. Very often um, he was interpreted as a socialist or a communist. Um, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a few minutes. But he was nominated for the Nobel Prize. I think one of the other lines of this ghazal, which is very interesting, um, is the "Dunya ne teri yaad se begana kar diya," right? "Tujhse bhi dil fareb hain gham rozgar ke." That the world has caused me to forget all thoughts of you. This is, of course, a shocking statement to say to the beloved, right?
That you're captivating, but you're not that captivating.
You're not that captivating, and that the sorrows of everyday living, are more deceitful than you.
I think we should sing this ghazal. It's a beautiful composition that Farida Khanum, my teacher, and one of the great ghazal singers, one of the great women ghazal singers of the 20th century, has performed this. The raga is called Shiv Ranjini. It's a beautiful mystical raga that comes to us from the south of India, from the Carnatic tradition. It gets absorbed into the Hindustani tradition. And it's actually a really dark melody, which I think is appropriate for this despairing sort of, I surrender ghazal.
तेरी याद से बेगाना कर दिया दुनिया ने तेरी याद से बेगाना कर तुझसे भी दिल फरेब गम रोज़गार के तुझसे भी दिल फरेब गम एक फुर्सते गुनाह मिले वो भी चार दिन परवरदिगार के दोनों जहां तेरी मोहब्बत में हार के दोनों जहां तेरी।
Wow, wow, wow. That was just wonderful. Very evocative. I think the melody so well with the message. So I think this brings us to the end, and as usual, it's been wonderful to work with you, Ali, on this particular project. And
Likewise.
I hope that this has been a very useful educational experience, but not just intellectually, but also emotionally for our audiences. And I think, especially given the time that we live in, pandemic, and it is very contradictory times. On the one hand, we're seeing compassion, and on the other hand, we're seeing hatred and selfishness. You know, both these opposing forces being manifest themselves around the world. And I think what the world of the Ghazal tells us is that be on the side of the right, be on the side of love, be on the side of compassion, and be on the side of caring for other human beings. So,
and I would just like to say one little thing, which is that, you know, given all this wonderful context that Professor Asani has sketched for us and shown us, and the kind of rich, long, varied, truly diverse tradition of Ghazal writing and of Ghazal singing, I think I have gained a lot of courage and confidence from precisely these lessons with Professor Asani, because I feel that this dichotomy that a lot of young Muslims in particular feel today, which is that they have to make this very extreme and sometimes violent choice between tradition and modernity, or between conservative values and liberal values, between, you know, their parents' or their grandparents' Islam and the world, dunya, that beckons to them in this day and age in 2020, with all its seductions and all its diversions. I think this binary is actually an illusion. And the Ghazal shows us that it is possible to navigate our complex realities by using metaphors such as the metaphors of the Ghazal, the metaphors of love, the metaphors of separation, the metaphors of being veiled, being half visible. I think it is okay to be comfortable with these complex emotional realities and these complex spiritual and intellectual realities. And this is why I feel the Ghazal is very much a genre of the here and now for us. In fact, in some ways more so than ever, because using the Ghazal, the traditional Ghazal, the Mujrai Ghazal, the socialist Ghazal, and Ghazals that we may write today to reflect our own identities, our own concerns, I think we can bridge those gaps between tradition on the one hand and, you know, the here and now or the future on the other. I think the Ghazal can help us undertake these beautiful creative journeys.
Thank you very much for those.
Thank you.
Thank you again. And Khuda Hafiz to everyone. And hopefully you have a wonderful, love-filled day.
Thank you.